All right, it's a really exciting day for me because I'm finally going to get to compare the two regularly available coilover solutions for the Torsion bar Honda game. There are other solutions on the market, but for the majority of folks who are going to try and either lower their car, race their car, or just even update and maintain their car, when they go and ask the other enthusiasts in our community, what suspension system should I buy? These two options are what are most talked about. On the right, I have the Medieval Pro Tein solution from Heel Toe Automotive. And on the left, I have the BC Racing coilover solution that is available from a myriad of distributors. Right off the bat, I should tell you that I paid full price retail for both of these kits shipped to my door. I received no discounts and no special promotions and promise for this review. I am genuinely fulfilling my own curiosity and hoping to dispel some rumors and some myths that I have heard over the years regarding these two kits. I have been a long-term user of the Medieval Pro kit. I've had a system from them that dates back to when they were first designed for our chassis, before BC Racing had entered into the space, and have had really good luck. I've loved the kits that I've owned, and then have had multiple friends have the BC Racing kit and have also loved that setup. I've driven one vehicle that has this setup on it, and I liked it so much I'm now in a unique position to own both of these kits. And while they're here at the same time on my bench before they're installed in a car, I want to collect some empirical data and look at the differences between these kits from a very technical standpoint. I don't want to focus on how they feel or what my opinion is of the coil spring conversion versus using the torsion bar in this video. Once the systems are installed in the vehicle, I will do a follow-up that talks more about the road mannerisms and how the kit functions while in the vehicle. But I don't see talked about very often at all the technical specification differences between the two kits. And for me, that is a really important part for our chassis. Specifically things like how much do the systems weigh? How much travel can you achieve from the front strut, which is already very space and travel limited in this chassis? How much droop can you accomplish with each of these systems, which is so crucial for a street car? Which reminds me that this will be talked about through the lens of a street car build. These systems are regularly used in tracked vehicles, but my car is used exclusively on the streets. And so I will be looking at a lot of these measurements and aspects through the lens of someone who is building I'll call it an advanced street car, where the ride is definitely stiffer than some would find comfortable to use in a daily driver, very well controlled and with good street mannerisms. I hope that this settles some debates, and I also hope that this generates some critical thinking. Rather than just going with crowd thought, I want to be able to give information to the community that can help you make an informed decision about which of these kits is best suited for your setup and what you're trying to do with your car.
First up is the BC Racing kit. Let's talk about how it comes from the website. So here we are looking at BC's site, and you can see that the MSRP on the kit at the time of filming this video is $1,245. This is the BR series kit from BC Racing, which is their most basic entry-level kit. In their description, it talks about how they're focused on comfort and not over-springing the dampers, which is typical of a lot of cheaper coilover systems where the ride is just super bouncy because the strut and shock can't control the super heavy spring. But they cram really heavy springs in the cars because they know you're going to slam it, and they're trying to get it to where you can get your car super low. BC's focused on drivability, and I really do appreciate that for these cars that are already limited in suspension travel and definitely can ride awful if you set them up incorrectly. You do have some options. They have extenders available. Extenders are just for the adjustment knobs themselves. So like in the rear interior plastics where these are hard to access, they can extend. There's a piece that extends these so that you can reach them without having to take any of the interior panels apart. And then you can also do a swift spring upgrade. Now, note, you can only do this on the front, and the reason is because BC actually made a interesting design choice for the spring setup on this car. The front is a traditional coilover spring. I think it's a 6-inch, maybe a 4-inch spring. But the rear has a different diameter on the bottom than it does at the top, which is not dissimilar to how the OEM spring setup is. But because of that, there are likely to be fewer manufacturers that make aftermarket springs in these diameters and probably also at this length. So you can get different spring rates from BC, but you can't do a swift spring upgrade on the rear. But you can definitely do one on the front, no problem at all. And regardless of whether you choose the Swift springs or not, you do get to choose your spring rates if you want to go different than what comes out of the box. So BC Racing recommends 3 kilogram in the rear and 4 kilogram in the front, which is a pretty soft setup, honestly. The 4 kilogram springs here is roughly the equivalent to running a 24 millimeter torsion bar on a regular front setup, like if you were to run the Tein MP dampers. And that is assuming you're using Civic CRX length torsion bars and Civic CRX length radius arms, which we can talk more about that later. But let's say you wanted to step up the spring rates, you can absolutely do so. You can go all the way to 10K in the front, and you can go all the way to 7K in the rear directly from BC Racing. Now, having said that, revalving may be required above certain spring rates, and you would need to talk to BC Racing. Basically, anything outside of what the normal 3 and 4K setup is, I'm assuming is a custom build, which they're quoting right now have a 3 to 4 week lead time, which is just fine. Basically, what they're going to do is revalve these dampers so that they can control the heavier spring, which is great. These are rebuildable and serviceable, and BC Racing can set them up for you to match whatever spring rate you want to run. These are monotube, and they're also linear piston damp curves. So it means they're not, crazy like digressive race shocks or anything like that. And they are also adjustable 30 ways, where both the compression and rebound is adjustable from one single knob. These are modifiable both from BC and from other companies, including like Redshift Motorsports is a company I know a lot of guys that race on BCs will send these coilovers to. They can turn them into track weapons. Digressive dampening, I think they can even make them multi-way adjustable and really kind of trick these things out. And that's cool because the way BC's done this is they've used a fairly universal cartridge internally, and then they have just designed mounting systems around those cartridges. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit, where the differences come from a multi-piece coilover system versus a full single-piece coilover like the Teins, and why there are advantages and disadvantages to both. I've heard misinformation parroted in our community for way too long, and I want to kind of dispel some of the rumors about why this system is not necessarily better just because it is a multi-piece system, or why the Teins are not necessarily worse for being all one piece. So we're going to get into that. As I mentioned, they are fully rebuildable. They talk about it here on their website. They've got a year warranty, so on and so forth. And when you order them from BC, they come exactly like this. I chose no options. I got them just as they were recommended from BC out of the box. And you get a couple of things with your coilovers. You get a couple of wrenches. So there's 3 different wrenches. A little tiny fella that is for this jam nut that locks the lower mount onto the shock cartridge, and then 2 spring perch wrenches that are for these perches here, a large and 2 small.
This one locks the lower mount. These two are for the spring. And then adjustment nuts for all four corners that mount onto the top of the strut and shock. Fully assembled, there's multiple pieces going on here. So we've got the lower strut mount, the strut cartridge itself inside here, the spring obviously in a dust boot. There is a bump stop inside here that we'll talk about in a little bit. And then we have this top hat, which is not spherical, to be noted, as a lot of manufacturers for one piece or, like multi-piece coilovers like this will include spherical top hats. These are not spherical. They are a hardened rubber design, and we're going to dig into this. And there is also a rotating spring perch, which is the yellow bit you can see sticking out here, which is a ball bearing design. It's not sealed, but it will allow the strut to turn independently from the top hat, since this is a strut design. On the rear, nice and simple, lower shock mount. We've got the rings, the spring perch rings, a plastic washer, the spring, and a top hat adapter. So effectively what this does is it rides inside of the stock spring isolator inside the vehicle and then adapts down to the BC Racing size spring. And then you've got a couple of washers, a bump stop that are supposed to mount into the factory upper shock mount inside the vehicle. So you will need to provide your own upper shock mount for the rear shock for the BC Racing setup. Let's move on and talk about the Teins. On Heel Toe's website, MSRP for the kit as of this recording is $1,099. And very similar to the BCs, these are what you could consider, an entry-level coilover system as it comes right out of the box. So they're linear damping curves. They're multi-adjustable, but single way, meaning both the compression and the rebound is adjusted by one knob. I believe each of them is nearly 30-way adjustable, maybe 25, 27, respectively. And they are offered with multiple spring rates. So from Heel Toe, you can get 4 kilogram all the way up to 7 kilogram springs at no additional cost without revalving the suspension. Now, you can go higher than that if you want, but the dampers do have to be revalved, and Heel Toe can facilitate that service for you. All you have to do is contact them if you need something more extreme than that. The kit here has 6K springs. I've run 4 and 5K in my cars before and found the 4K to be a bit soft for me. The 5K is pretty great, and I wanted to try 6K springs, so I've got some options that I can actually run through on the Teins. And when I'm doing my comparisons to be the most as fair as possible, I'll definitely have the 4K springs for the Teins in that are the softest available here, which match best with the BCs. There's not a whole lot else to talk about with the Teins because the additional setup that you need to do is not included with these coilovers, and that has to do with torsion bar selection. And it's my opinion that that's why some people shy away from this kit, is because you have a entire other situation that you have to think about. Heel Toe sells combo kits where you can get these with a matched pair of torsion bars, and that's awesome because they'll actually match a set of torsion bars to a set of springs for you and give you a recommendation. But torsion bars are just one of those things that not a lot of folks understand, and I definitely get it. If you've never worked on a car with torsion bars before, it can be a little bit intimidating. And so, it's not measured as straightforward as a spring where it's X number of pounds will get you X number of inches or millimeters of compression. And that's, coilover springs are usually always linear. So every time you add an extra X number of pounds or kilograms, the spring is going to compress an additional inch. That's super easy to understand. Torsion bars, there's twisting forces involved. You have to measure lengths of the bar itself, lengths of the radius arm, and it can be confusing. Now, having said that, if you're willing to do the digging, Heel Toe makes it really easy. They have charts available on their website that explain to you if you're using this radius arm and this torsion bar, you will effectively have this spring rate. So what I was talking about earlier with the spring rates that come on the BCs, they're roughly the equivalent to a 24 millimeter torsion bar. I've got a vehicle that has 24 millimeter torsion bars in it that I'll be doing this testing on primarily. And I have a vehicle with 27 millimeter torsion bars that I usually run paired with 5K springs in the back. I have a friend local who is also going to be running the BCs that has a car with 29 millimeter torsion bars currently installed. So we're going to be able to run through a couple of different setups and kind of get a feel for how they compare across multiple ranges of stiffness. Now, the Tein systems are a lot quicker to talk about just because there are fewer pieces. They are a single piece design, meaning the mounts are integrated into the body of the dampers themselves. So here we have the front strut, bump stop, boot, some washers, and that's it. This top hat is something I have provided for the measurements of this vehicle. This is a OEM replacement top hat. It's very well used, as you can see, but it is a rubber style top hat. There are plenty of aftermarket top hats available, and I have like a spherical set that I may get out if I need to for some measurements on this kit today. You can also run caster camber plates right out of the box with the Tein kit, and that is one of the advantages to the Tein kit, is that without any customization, you can run caster camber plates bolted directly onto the top of this strut. With the BCs, there are some guys that are doing some really cool stuff where they are modifying the spring perch to accept caster camber plates. I've not seen a car that's actually running around with that setup on the street, but it does look promising, and it obviously is very doable if you are willing to put in the effort on your own. But BC Racing does not offer that as a solution out of the box. So we're, for the sake of this conversation, only going to discuss how you could put these together as they come from the manufacturer. And so the Tein gets a little leg up there in the sense that you do have customization options for the top of the strut. The rear shock, really straightforward. Integrated mount, as we discussed. Hardened rubber lower bushing. Coilover sleeve here is separate from the body, not welded. It just has an indentation here, a tab that keeps it from spinning. Then it has the coil spring perches, a plastic washer for isolation, spring, and an adapter. And again, this adapter is going to slide up into the rubber isolator inside of the vehicle, which is the stock component. Then we have a bump stop and a series of washers that are, again, going to bolt into the OEM top shock mount. So you will need to provide either your stock shock mount or replacement original shock mount in order to install either of these kits into the rear of the vehicle. For the wrenches and tools, Tein's setup actually just uses two of the exact same wrench. These two perches are so similar in diameter that you just need one size wrench duplicated, and then there is an adjuster extender included with the Teins that allows you to reach down a little bit farther, say into, again, rear interior plastics or in an inaccessible area to make an adjustment on these struts. Speaking of the adjustment, one thing on the Teins is they also include a protective dust boot, and it is very important that you run these. I have definitely had sets and talked to people with sets that have not run the dust boot, and it's not an immediate occurrence. It takes years worth of use in wet and dirty environments. But these click adjusters can and do get clogged up, and they actually can eventually snap off. But there is good news, even if that happens to you, which brings up a good point about both the Teins and the BCs, and that is that replacement parts are readily available from the manufacturer for both of these systems. I've had to replace the lower shock bushings. I've had to replace the click adjusters, and each of these parts are just a couple of dollars from the place that I got these kits from, and are super easy to install onto the coilovers themselves. So it's really nice when you buy into these ecosystems one way or the other, because if a single component fails, you're not stuck replacing the entire product. In fact, if the Teins are still new enough, it really can be cost effective to rebuild them if they ever do need a rebuild. And certainly if you need them revalved, say if you change spring rates and go to a much more aggressive spring rate, you can do that on both the BCs and on the Teins. So next, we're going to talk about some technical specifications. Let's do some measuring and get one each of the Tein and BCs in the front configuration laid up here on the bench. First up, let's discuss shock length. So this is an important feature of any good suspension system. The more travel you can build into your system, the better off you'll be usually. You want to have a decent amount of droop so that the tire remains in contact with the ground at all times. You want to have enough compression travel so that you're not running out of suspension stroke before landing squarely on the bump stops. So you don't want to just be riding around on the street on the bump stops. The way I have this set up right now is I have the Teins exactly as they come out of the box, using a stock replacement top hat, and I've got the washers under it oriented exactly how Tein recommends it from the manufacturer. The BCs I have set up exactly how they come out of the box, just with the spring and the dust boot removed. So this lower collar and this lower strut mount and these spring perches are exactly where BC Racing sets them out of the box. I've just taken the top hat off and removed the spring. And with that done, the difference is a lot, really, quite frankly, between these two systems. So overall shock length at this particular setup is quite different. Now, keep in mind that the BCs are adjustable in this way, so you can physically drop this sleeve down, and you could make the BCs as long as the Teins, for sure. But as BC sets them up out of the box, they're quite a bit shorter. And you'll also notice that the amount of exposed strut shaft is quite different between the two systems. And this is going to be a measure of total suspension travel. Now, obviously, at ride height, neither of these coilovers is going to be fully extended like this. They're going to be slightly compressed. But at full droop, the total distance available to you in travel on the Tein system is right at 3 and almost 7/8 of an inch of full stroke. And on the BCs, you're looking at just over 2 and call it 1/8 of an inch. So quite a big difference there in total stroke available to you. There are multiple reasons for this. When I mentioned earlier in the video about how there are some advantages and some disadvantages to these designs, one of the disadvantages usually found with multi-piece coilovers is the reduction in overall shaft travel. And the reason for that is because this cartridge is largely a universal component. Now, the valving and the fluid viscosity and everything inside can be unique to a chassis, and BC may tune this cartridge specifically for this chassis, but the cartridge itself is a universal-ish component. And then they design an upper and a lower strut mount to fit that particular vehicle. Well, what you give up there is real estate. The bottom of this strut mount is hollow, and I'm reaching all the way up in here, and I can just about touch, I can touch the bottom of the strut, which means this much of the lower mount is used for nothing but the mount. You cannot put strut shaft in this section of the strut itself because it is taken up with the lower mounting bracket. Where the Teins, being a single piece, every bit of this body is available real estate for fluid, for valving, and for shaft travel. So this is a fantastic setup for cost, because what the manufacturer can do is machine custom mounts for upper and lower versions for each specific vehicle, and then recycle components that cost a lot of money, like this cartridge. Where the Teins, this is an entire bespoke part for this vehicle, and it cannot fit other vehicles unless they happen to share the exact same suspension setup. So this is obviously going to cost more because they can only make it fit that one particular vehicle. Now, that doesn't mean that this system inherently is bad because of this setup. It is just a sacrifice that you make when you build multi-piece coilover setups. And it is something that you need to keep in mind. It's a decision made by the manufacturer in order to keep costs down. One of the reasons that a lot of manufacturers don't take up the torch and build tons of coilover solutions for our vehicles is there's a lot of R&D that goes into this stuff. This lower mount here would have taken a lot of time to design and engineer. This upper perch, same thing. Tein, exact same situation. They had to design and measure this strut from scratch in order to get a solution that would fit and work at various ride heights, because these are customizable solutions. They've got to be able to work for various people's needs in multiple solutions. So body length here, quite a bit different between the two systems. For full compression, we're going to actually measure that on the vehicle. So we'll be able to see what the total travel is when compressed. And we're going to move this collar up and down a little bit and kind of play with that some. But we'll be able to see how much is available for in the compression direction. But total length is a lot longer on the Teins, and the total droop available is considerably longer on the Teins as well, which definitely can play well for street driving mannerisms. So when you're going over large yumps and bumps, hitting unexpected speed bumps, the droop available in a suspension system often can dictate how comfortable the vehicle is, because as soon as this shock runs out of travel in the expansion direction, it's a very abrupt loss of traction on the tires on the pavement, because obviously now the vehicle is picking the wheels up off the ground because the suspension can no longer droop any farther. So generally, the more droop you can have, the better a suspension is going to feel on the street, especially over the large bumps. Let's talk about the total length and actually measure it. So from the top of the strut mount, where it would meet the chassis, down to the pinch bolt is going to be our constant measurement length. And out of the box, the Teins, we're looking at just over 16.5 inches, maybe 16 3/4 almost, of total body length. And the BCs, again, this is an adjustable value, but out of the box is set up to be right at, call that 14 3/4 of an inch from the top of the strut mount down to that lower pinch bolt. So again, this could be extended to match this, but for every bit you push this lower mount out, you lose total travel down. So it is a game where you have to push and pull. One really great way to visualize this compression is to just compress the struts. At the height the BCs come out of the box, fully compressed, versus the Teins, which obviously you cannot adjust here. So fully compressed is fully compressed. If we measure the BCs, again, we're going to go from the top of the top hat. We are sitting right at, we'll call that 12 3/4 of an inch into the pinch bolt notch on the coilover. Where on the Teins, if we do the exact same test, lay above the strut mount, we are sitting at right at 12 3/4 of an inch into the pinch bolt. So the Teins have the exact same amount of compression available that the BCs do, with all that extra length for droop that the BCs did not have. So for the guys that want to run super low, you obviously can shorten this BC strut up even farther. But you do have to be mindful that the shorter you make this overall travel, the more likely you're going to be to contact something inside of the fender well. A really crucial test anytime you're setting up suspension in a vehicle is actually to remove the spring completely and put your wheel on and compress it all the way up into the wheel well, and then rotate the steering throughout its entire sweep and make sure that the tire is not touching anything that's going to bottom the vehicle out on the tire before it bottoms out onto the bump stops. So you would have to do that test with the BCs before you start shoving this lower mount up and up and up, because obviously you do have a little bit of room here that we could compress this strut a little bit farther. I don't know how far the lower mount will go, but let's just say we have the distance available. It looks like we can drop this thing about 1.25 inches lower. So we could make the body 1.25 inches shorter, assuming we have the thread available in here. But then that will reduce the total droop or the total length of the shock as well by 1.25 inches. So again, it's that balancing act. You know, how much droop and overall travel do you want to have in the strut body length, and how much compression can you have without contacting anything inside of the wheel well. As it comes out of the box, the way BC sets it up, Tein and BC, exact same level or exact same shock length, fully compressed. Tein definitely has an advantage over full droop. You know, and out of curiosity, I just went ahead and bottomed out the lower strut mount. So this is absolutely as high as this strut mount will go. I bottomed it out and then just tightened the lock ring down on top of it. And I didn't gain as much as I thought I would. So before we were sitting at right at 12 3/4 of an inch. Now we're at 12 inches almost exactly. So I got 3/4 of an inch additional shortening of the body from how BC sets it up right out of the box, which just, you know, again, as a reminder, is 3/4 of an inch also shorter than the Teins are. And that is just in total body length. Don't confuse that for strut travel, because again, the shorter you make this lower mount, the shorter the overall assembly is, and it is not impacting the total strut travel that you have available on the shaft itself. And just in case you needed one more way of visualizing this, here we have the BCs still fully compressed or fully shortened, so the lower mount has been run up onto the cartridge as far as I can get it, and we're talking a massive difference now. So from the top of the hat on the Teins, we still have our 16 3/4 inches of total strut length. We're on the BCs now, we are down to 14 inches of total strut length. So, you know, use these measurements at your own risk, I guess I should say. Know what you're going to be giving up by not having this available length, and know what you're going to be giving up with this much suspension travel itself. So much more travel here with the Teins than the BCs, and much more strut length overall with the Teins than the BCs. Time to talk about weight. It's every first generation CRX owner's favorite topic of conversation. You know, every pound turns you more and more into a race car driver. So the less weight your suspension weighs, the better. You know, obviously everybody's chasing grams. So let's give in to that and let's get some weights measured between the two systems. In all seriousness, the biggest reason I wanted to weigh these is because I hear a misconception a lot of times that the BCs are going to weigh a ton because the spring is obviously moved into the strut itself, and therefore it's obviously got to weigh a lot more than the Teins. And then the Teins, I hear all the time, they're so superior because you're moving a lot of unsprung weight under the chassis down low by putting the torsion bars in their factory locations and not having the spring mounted up high on the strut itself. The second part that I said is definitely true. So the torsion bars are sprung weight because they're mounted to the chassis, where this suspension system here is going to be a part of the unsprung weight of everything in the suspension components that hangs off the vehicle. So pound for pound is not going to be a direct comparison here because you still have to account for the torsion bars under the vehicle when talking about the Teins. However, if you talk to BC Racing, they tell you to run a torsion bar with these BCs. They specify that you leave the stock torsion bars in the car, and then you can re-index them to get the car lower if you would like. So if you follow BC's recommendations, you're going to have this coil spring and you're going to have a torsion bar. I've driven a vehicle that had the torsion bar completely removed while running the BCs, and I thought that it handled okay, but I think that you would need to play with your spring rates if you wanted to do some very high performance driving, because the springs setup on these BCs is somewhat soft. So if you make the decision to remove the torsion bars completely, you may have to play with spring rates some. Your mileage may vary there. Without further ado, let's get to measuring now by starting off with the Teins. I have the stock steel replacement upper strut mounts installed. If you had something all aluminum or really lightweight up here, you could affect this by a couple of ounces probably, but not a lot. The strut mount itself, I think, is only about 15, 16 ounces. I measured it earlier. With the top hat in place, we're coming in at 7 pounds, almost 6 ounces for the Tein MP damper. And the BCs, we're looking at 8 pounds and almost 1 ounce. So not a huge difference if you consider the fact that this strut has got a whole spring and spring isolator assembly and everything that the Teins do not. Now, why is that? Well, aluminum construction is my best guess. So this lower mount, some parts on the cartridge, the upper perch, and obviously these collars and everything are all made out of aluminum, where on the Teins, the entire assembly is steel. So it's going to carry more weight in itself because of the material that it's made out of. But there's one other small difference that is not only playing into the weight of these systems, but has a hand in another important measurement under the chassis that I want to discuss. Let's talk about diameters. Because this is a structural suspension member, the more rigid it is, the more effective it will be at keeping everything in its place. So depending on the manufacturer, the shaft and the body of different strut assemblies are going to be different diameters. And it's generally considered that the thicker the material, the stiffer it's going to be. Now, when do you get diminishing returns on that? I'm not sure. And we're talking about street car applications here again. So how much is more than you need in a street car? You're never really going to notice the difference, but it does play a factor in a few ways, and I want to talk about those. So I've got the calipers here zeroed out. The shaft diameter on the Teins is right at 22 millimeters. The shaft diameter on the BCs is right at 20 millimeters. So 22 millimeters versus 20 millimeters across the entire distance of that shaft is another reason why the weights are going to be slightly different between these two systems. Now, it also plays a factor on how big the bodies have to be in order to contain a decent amount of fluid to keep temperatures down and to make sure that the struts themselves are nice and efficient. So that brings me to this old set of Teins that I have. This is from the V1 setup from Tein, and they used to be a bit thicker. The shafts themselves were the same, but the body size was larger. Here you can see the body on the original Teins is about 55 millimeters. where the body on the new Teins is about 51 millimeters. So they've made the body a little bit smaller, and whatever the design choice was to make it smaller, I appreciate, because when running a large tire, you do run the risk of rubbing against the strut body in these vehicles. There is only so much space under the chassis, and so when you run out of room, something's got to give. This was a 205/50/15 tire on, I believe, a 38 or so millimeter, or 38 offset wheel. It did not rub while just rolling down the road. This was under deflection, so obviously your tire moves under different loads, your wheel bends and flexes under different loads, and so this was when the suspension was really loaded up. I would get tire rub here, and I believe this was even a little bit of rim rub here. And the reason that is an important thing to know and understand is, in order to correct this, you either have to run a different size tire, a different offset wheel, or run wheel spacers to push the wheel out. So you might think, great, run wheel spacers, no problem. Well, you've got to account for the fender as well. Especially on the CRXs, you're really limited on how much space you can push any wheel and tire package out. I already had the fenders scalloped on the vehicle that these were installed on to give myself just even a little bit more space to push the wheel and tire package out, and I had it out as far as it would possibly go. So I could not have run a wheel spacer on this setup at all. It wouldn't have fit, or I would have had to have cut the fender in order to make it fit, or maybe run a ton of negative camber, and then I could have, put a spacer on the wheel. But this is crucial, because now let's go back to the BCs for a second and look at where the spring actually lands on the in the same area of interference that the Teins do. So actually, give me a second. Let me get a loaded one. Here we are. So I've got a fully loaded BC, exactly how it comes out of the box, sitting next to this Tein that I've got a little bit of rub wear on. And I have the lower pinch bolt locations lined up on them both. So if pound for pound, if this was installed in the same vehicle, where would the tire contact? Well, it looks like maybe we'd get some rim contact somewhere here on this lower mount, and we would get some tire contact somewhere here near this spring perch. Now, obviously, I could adjust this coilover up or down this lower mount in order to try and mitigate this some, but still, you can't get away from all of that width. We're sitting at 59 millimeters on the diameter of the lower strut mount itself. And then if you were trying to get the tire away from the locking collar, you're going to be playing against 68.5 millimeters, give or take a few, of room here. So that is quite a big difference that you're going to be fighting against on your wheel and tire package, and that's just something else that you must consider. In order to run the exact same wheel and tire as I was running here, I would have to run a spacer. And in order to run a spacer, I would have to do something about my fenders or change my alignment specs in order to get the tire to fit under the fender. So everything is a give and take. It's a waterfall. That's just the way car builds go. And this is no different. If you are going to run the BCs, you will need to consider your wheel and tire specs in order to ensure that you get proper clearance inside of the wheel well. Now, before you start skipping ahead, don't worry, we're not going to go as crazy on the rear, because honestly, it's just not as important on this chassis. We're going to cover the basics and we're going to move on. These are both systems directly out of the box. Collars not moved at all. In this configuration here, got the bottoms lined up. You can see, the top of the Tein strut ends about here. The top of the BC strut ends down here. So again, a similar situation where in the stock configuration, the BCs are going to have less droop than the Teins. Now you can affect that again because you can thread this body out and then you can raise the spring perch up to compensate. If you need to have the car sit higher, You absolutely can do that, it appears, with the BCs, because these bodies are threaded way down in here, I know. So you can, thread this out a lot if you want to get closer to that stock ride height.
This is your narrator coming to you from the future. This is actually incorrect. I measured the BCs after this video was filmed, and BC states you have to leave about 22 to 25 millimeters of the shot cartridge threaded into that lower mount. And because of this, you can only extend the BCs so far, and fully extended with the spring at its highest position on the lower perch, the total height capable from the BCs is actually no better than the Teins, unfortunately.
Safely, but I would imagine you could get close. If not, you could at least get them to sit as high as the Teins. I do feel confident in that. Everything else appears to be very similar, which is why we're just not going to dive into this as deeply, because the suspension travel in the rear of these vehicles is just not limited like it is in the front. You can absolutely tuck the rear wheel, not even the tire. You can tuck the rear wheel all the way into the chassis using the Teins without sitting directly on the bump stops, and that's more than anyone's ever going to need. So if the Teins can do that at this length, then the BCs certainly can do that at this length, which means you can go as low as you want in the rear, no problem. You're limited at the front, not at the back. BCs in recap come with softer springs than the Teins do. They also come with a longer spring and a mixed diameter spring, where the inner diameter of the top versus the bottom of the BC spring is different, where the Tein uses the same size on the top and the bottom, making the springs a little bit easier to find. Now, for weight comparison, there's going to be a bit of a tricky way I have to do this. I am going to have to keep a hand on this to keep it standing upright, but I'm going to just kind of let it lean against my hand here, and we'll get a rough measurement. So we're sitting around 8.1, or excuse me, 8 pounds and an ounce, 8 pounds, 2 ounces, hovering somewhere in there for the Teins. And for the BCs, we are going to see 5 pounds. 8 ounces, 9 ounces. So 5 pounds, roughly 9 ounces for the BCs. Now, weight savings here is, I wouldn't say insignificant. And that, again, is going to come down to aluminum construction. Now, this is a shock, not a strut. It is not a suspension component or suspension member. Therefore, it is not carrying load beyond its own damping forces. So the rigidity of this matters not to the actual performance of the suspension. So the lighter you could have this setup, the better. And so for this measurement, the BC is a clear winner by a couple of pounds, and that is due to a largely aluminum construction in the body, where the Tein is all steel. All right, it's time to wrap up and do some final thoughts on a couple of the accessories that come with the BCs. So first, the accessories. We talked about the top hat the BCs come with and how the spring has to rotate separately due to the design. So inside of this aluminum cup lives these 2 half plastic with metal race ball bearings set up. So there's ball bearings, some grease, a metal race, another metal race here that just kind of sits inside of this plastic, and then those 2 halves just clip together. They're not sealed or anything like that. An observation, and this is purely speculative, but this is going to be a service item. There's just no way it's not. The top hats you can see here, these are used OEM replacement top hats. They get a little bit of corrosion going on them. These aftermarket top hats, they've got a little bit of corrosion, or a lot of corrosion going on them. When I've worn out a bearing in these before, and some of that's due to corrosion, some of it's due to loading. But the weather just gets in here. It gets everywhere. And that's why I was recommending you definitely want to get some anti-seize in these threads, is because this is exposed to the environment. and it's definitely going to cause corrosion to build up. This is not sealed. This is going to get water in it. This is going to require service. And so don't think for a minute that this is going to last you for forever. You're going to need to take it apart and service it. It's not a huge deal. I'm not saying it's not going to last for a long time. It probably will. It seems very well protected up in here, and it's the furthest away from the debris that any portion of the strut could be. But this still gets really dirty. I take all four wheels off of my cars every time I come home from one of my big trips to the mountains, and there is always all sorts of gunk and stuff caked up inside of here. And if it wasn't for the dust boots that you run, the struts would be absolutely ruined in very short order because of all the debris that gets up inside of the top of the strut. So just keep in mind, this is something you're probably going to have to look into cleaning and maintaining if you have a set of BCs on your car. They're well-made pieces, but they are just plastic. You can see it doesn't even really stay together on its own. They just kind of come apart. But it's just plastic. It's just ball bearings. I'm sure you can get replacements from BC, but it is something you're going to want to check into, because if this starts to bind, it will just cause, if nothing else, noise, vibration, and harshness into the chassis. Second is, let's just take a look at this top hat situation. So inside of here is just a rubber suspension bushing. So it obviously presses out this way, and you, I'm sure, could get some replacements of these either from BC, or this may even be a generic item that you can get replacements for. But either way, it's not spherical, and I just thought that was worth noting. There's some guys that are doing some interesting stuff with these. They're replacing this with a camber caster plate setup by using a aftermarket spring perch adapter, which would be required in order to, lock the spring under the top hat. You cannot just switch a aftermarket top hat like this onto the BCs. It will not work. You have to adapt the isolator collar here to be able to continue to hold the spring in place. And so, you are limited there in the sense that you cannot, right out of the box, put caster and camber plates on top of the BCs. You would only be able to do that on the Teins. There's probably 20 other things that we could talk about with these two systems, but the bottom line is they're great options, and honestly, we're blessed to even have these as an option. These cars are very unloved and undersupported, and I'm thankful that we have two very high-quality solutions available for our chassis. I can't wait to get them both installed, get miles on them, and be able to come back here and give you my honest impressions on how the vehicles perform and ride with each of these respective systems installed. So thanks for sticking around. I know this was a lot, but if you really wanted that deep dive, hopefully this gets you what you needed and allows you to make an informed decision about which system might be best suited for you and your application. Thanks so much for watching. Take care.